Okay, so it's really important we break down audience. Audience is kind of everything when it comes to rhetoric, because without an audience, you're just kind of in a room talking and you don't know who you're trying to convince or what you're trying to relay. So audiences are really, really important. So today, of course, I have my owl friend who's going to be our stand-in audience here. And we're going to talk about the different elements that you really want to consider when you're thinking about audience. These are things you could write about when you're analyzing a piece of rhetoric. So if you hear a speech, if you read an article, if you watch a movie or read a book, any of those things, if you look at a picture, you can think about audience and what the audience is like. So let's start with the two big points of audience. Number one, you can have an intentional or an unintentional audience. So let me give you an example. If I'm talking to you on this recording, you are my intended audience. So for me, the intended audience is 16 to 17-year-old high school students at my school studying rhetoric because they're in an AP class. That is an intentional audience. An unintentional audience in the same circumstance would be anyone on YouTube where I post this who just happens to come across this and wants to learn about rhetoric. I don't really know who they are or what age they are, what biases they have, what they think of Bills fans who are teaching in their shop. I don't know any of that stuff, so it's all unintentional. Intentional allows me to think about ways to address you. So for instance, I might say, well, they're 16 to 17-year-olds. What do I know about that? And I could go through the different pop culture elements. I could try to implement some of that in my conversation. I could try to think about what they care about as far as this class, what they're nervous about, what they believe, what they think, what they feel, what I was like at 17 or 16. I can think about all of that stuff and try to enter into that intended audience, strategy or approach. For the unintended audience, you really don't have a choice. And therefore, you can come into some kind of problematic situations. Because if there's someone there who thinks you're A, ignoring them, or B, you say something and they're like, I don't agree with that, that could just be a case of an unintentional audience. However, it doesn't remove the onus from you that you should be trying to appeal to that intended audience, and you don't want to, ruin that relationship with an unintended audience depending on the circumstances. So let's talk about the different kinds of audiences and what you do if you experience them. So number one, we have a hostile or strongly disagreeable audience. So this would be something like, if again, and I've given this example a lot, so I'm sorry if you don't know it, but if I'm a Bills fan, which is a football team, and someone is a Patriots fan, Owl here is a Patriots fan, and that Owl says, go Patriots, I love the Patriots, we're the best team, which they have been for the last decade. I'm sorry to record that on a video. But they're amazing. They've won a lot of Super Bowls. They're really, really good. And the Bills haven't been very good. They're supposed to be good this year, but they haven't been very good. I would become a hostile audience to the speaker who is an owl. So, if the speaker wants to address me and I'm a hostile audience, they have to make certain strategic choices. So, for instance, they could emphasize points of agreement. So the owl could say, hey, I like football too, and you like football. And you know what? We both don't like the Miami Dolphins. And then I'd go, nice, nice. And I might be willing to listen a little bit more to what my hostile my speaker to my hostile audience, to what they're saying. The next kind of audience you might have is just a step below hostile. Hostile's kind of a scary audience, by the way. That means they really don't like you. But the next step down would be a skeptical audience. So for instance, you've probably had this in a class you've been in before, where the class is not really sure if the teacher knows what they're talking about, and they've started to become skeptical of that teacher. And so maybe they ask a little bit more pointed questions. Maybe they start saying, like, do you really know what you're talking about? And unfortunately for that teacher, they need strategies that help to resurrect that ethos that they're working from, so that their audience isn't skeptical of them anymore. and that's more challenging. So, they might address opposing viewpoints, for instance. They might say things like, I know you guys think I'm a young teacher who isn't really sure what I'm talking about, but let me assure you that I've done X, Y, and Z that have helped establish my knowledge on this topic. And by doing so, you establish for the audience that you have experience, and they might move from skepticism away to something like being receptive. And that's really what you're usually dealing with, is a receptive audience. And that's an audience who's there. They're not really angry, but they're also not like totally on your side. But they're willing to listen to what you have to say. So for them, you might focus on stressing what commonalities you have with the audience. Or you might say something like, try this out. I'm going to give you a call to action. I want you guys to do X, Y, or Z. Because they're receptive, you don't have to do as much to establish your own credibility. Because they're already listening to you, which is the key thing. Lastly, that's the uninformed or apathetic audience. And I'll tell you, from a teacher's point of view, this is the hardest group. If someone is apathetic or they're uninformed, your job is just to fill in a lot of that information. So for instance, you might have to really capture their attention. If I'm at the front of the classroom and a kid is sitting there and they're like, I don't know why I would care about rhetoric or English, like why do I have to do this? I just want to do anything else. I need to capture their attention somehow. I need to say, this is what fuels every interaction you're going to have with every person every day. You need to be fundamentally aware of rhetoric because it will influence everything about your interactions. So any interaction you have with teachers, with the administration, with the outside world, everything you post on social media, all of those are rhetorical situations. You have to care about it. Because if you don't, you are at risk of dropping the ball when you had an opportunity to influence people. Or you might unintentionally do something that really harms another person because you aren't thinking about rhetoric at all. So those 4 types of audiences are critical when thinking about rhetorical analysis. And especially when you are thinking about, what do I want to say to this group? When you break down who the audience is, that helps you move forward in that discussion. There is a worksheet linked in this video if you want to see that breakdown. There's a lot more strategies on there. That's what I'm cheating off of on this little tablet right here. So look through those strategies because you're going to be tasked with constructing your own arguments, not just analyzing others. And so the more you can think about an audience as a dynamic group, the better you can address that group. Now, I think it goes without saying, not everyone in an audience is hostile. Not everyone in an audience is receptive. Usually there's a variation of the two, but oftentimes you'll get groupings of those people. A last example I'll leave you with is when I pass back papers, for instance. That's one thing I see in my classroom a lot, is sometimes students will take that very personally. And I'll notice that an audience goes from receptive to hostile, depending on the individual who received the paper back. Sometimes I have to, as the teacher, work on how to engage with an audience that is now a little bit hostile. You know, if they say, why did I get this grade? I need to take a step back and say, well, let's once again focus on what the purpose is of grading. And think about how this is a growth opportunity. It's not the end all be all or anything like that.